All right, we are live. Excited to be here and talking about a really important issue that we've heard many of our clients talking about, just with the uncertainty in the economy. Things that have sort of happened over the last couple of years, from a pandemic to, and economics going really well. Now we're kind of facing this, what's going on, the uncertainty of our economy, and just work being a little slower than I think many of us expected to. We've heard a lot of clients unfortunately having to make the decision or have the discussions about making the decision to reduce staff, and that is never an easy topic to talk about. It's always one that I think we should take a lot of time, put a lot of empathy, a lot of thought into those conversations. So I've assembled a panel, I think, of experts who I think will have a lot to offer to this conversation. And we'll be taking questions as we go along. So if you want to send those in, I'll ask our panel here. But I'm going to ask each person to introduce themselves. We'll start with Stacy, who's a colleague of mine. Stacy and I met a number of years ago. She's served as Chief Operations Officer at a digital agency. So Stacy, tell us a little bit about you.
Hi, I am in Charleston, South Carolina, and actually am nearing the end of a summer sabbatical that I've taken after being COO. So I've been spending the summer with my two kiddos and traveling and having a good time. But I'm excited to be here today and share anything that I've learned. There's a lot to learn from those battle wounds and the tough times.
Yeah. Doug, why don't you introduce yourself? Doug is the managing partner at Kaufman CPA Group. Doug and I actually met a couple of years ago as well. Doug, tell us a little bit about you and a little bit about your firm.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. Doug Kaufman. I'm in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Team is here as well. And our mission is to provide financial clarity and peace of mind for the clients that we work with. So that, that's the why. The what is outsourced accounting, fractional CFO services, some tax mixed in there as well. And working with, I would say, small to medium-sized businesses, depending on your definition of small to medium. With the goal of financial clarity for those folks.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Doug. And then Kevin and I met not that long ago, but have become good friends through a mutual friend of ours. Kevin founded and leads Klein Solomon Mills, which is a law firm here in Nashville. So Kevin, tell us a little bit about you.
Yes, Zach, thank you for having me. KSM, Klein Solomon Mills, I started that about 10 years ago. I'm a lawyer, primarily employment law and all things employment law, from sort of inception. Who are you hiring? How are you structuring compensation? All the way to, we got to let somebody go because it's not working out. And part of our mission at the firm is to cover all of those things for clients. We've got eight lawyers. We all have slightly different focus. Mine is primarily litigation in the employment world. So anyway, excited to talk about compassionate layoffs.
Yeah. And we'll try to keep the lawyer and accountant jokes to a minimum today on our call.
Thank you.
All right, I'd love to just kind of start with this question, and Doug and Stacy, I'll put this one out to you. When as a leader, you're leading a company, maybe you're a company owner, and you're starting to think about, do I have the right size staff? What are some of the things that we need to be looking out for? So really, how do we recognize when a reduction in force might be necessary, when layoffs might be necessary, when we might be overstaffed? What are some of those indicators that this is a question that we should start wrestling with and talking about?
I think that it's a lot of those lead metrics that tend to come from the CFO side. So I don't know, Doug, if you want to speak to that, and then I'll speak to the operation side of the house.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I always look at that and say, what do the numbers say? Well, it's I think it's great that Kevin, what you mentioned about the kind of the compassionate side of things, because it's easy for me to dive in to just look at the numbers and say, well, the numbers say that your cost of people is too high, so you got to get rid of some people. It's like, well, no, if it were that simple, if it were as simple as the numbers, we would have done that by now. But that's kind of the starting point in my mind of what are the numbers telling you this isn't going to work? What does the financial projection look like? Is there even a financial projection in place? And what are the what are the ratios for your industry or even your business specifically that you've determined you kind of need to I think of it as guardrails, because a specific target ratio is you're always going to be high or low. You almost never hit it exactly. But what are those guardrails where we're like, okay, as long as it's within this range, we're pretty good. It looks like it's going to start falling outside that range. We either need to hire or reduce. And then thinking, and hopefully you can predict that far enough in the future that it gives you time to make the decision well. But high level, it's a projection. To me, it's a projection. What does the projection say? Do we know what our cost of people needs to be, or what the range needs to be? And if it's starting to get outside of that range, then we bring in some of the other folks on this call. Hey, I think we're going to have a problem. What do we do? So,
yeah,
Stacy, that's where I start.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So looking at those projections. So in my case, in a service-based business where things are changing so quickly, looking 3 months out that you need to have like a really clear picture, and 6 months out, you need to have like a medium-sized picture, because you know that things are going to change. And when the 3-month picture looks a little bit scary, then you start to think about what are our levers? Is there increase in work opportunities? Is there, what are our opportunities to flex that 3-month window? That 6-month window is hopefully where you're really looking and saying, if it looks bad, we're going to need to make some decisions. And so what it looks bad might look like is if you're a billable service-based business, as an example, your utilization numbers or your projections for your team are dropping over that period of time, and you don't have work in the pipeline that you expect to come in to meet that gap, right? And so we're looking at all of the levers, like your financial projections, your cash flow. Can you tolerate a gap in work? What are your utilization numbers and your work output look like? And can your team fulfill on that? Or do you have too many people to fulfill on that? And if so, who are they, or what are their areas, right? And then looking at some other factors, like you have a bunch of people that have time off that they need to use, that you can like start to negotiate in some of those ways to fill in gaps. But I feel like that 6-month window is where you're really figuring out your gap fill, or if you're going to have to make some tough decisions for the business.
And Stacy, just to kind of go off of that, I think one of the big implications when you're laying off staff is, who's going to do that work, or, this, even in the case of like a 3 or 6 month window, things might be really tight now, but when we look at the 6-month picture, we might have a whole bunch of work coming in. And at that point, we have no one to do the work, right? Like we're going to have people who are billable at 100%. And we're going to have a whole bunch of stuff, that's just sort of waiting out there. So how do you sort of start making those decisions when we don't have work now? Maybe it's looking like we have it in the future, or now we've started to affect our ability to even sell.
And the sales pipeline, salespeople tend to be optimistic by nature. And so the sales pipeline tends to look rosy. I feel like usually, people are like, oh, we got all this stuff coming, but your numbers and your forecast have to tell you a more objective picture. So I think you have to identify what work looks like it could be outsourced more easily, where you could find a team that isn't in-house potentially. You have to look at what work can be filled by maybe like a multidisciplinary person inside your business, if that's possible, depending on your area of business. And if you have work coming in that's high opportunity and high reward, where you feel pretty confident in it, and you've got some people that would have to sit on the bench until then, you have to make that business decision about whether you can absorb that cash flow and that risk in the in-between time. I know in my experience, we have done that, where we're like, there's a project coming in that we feel really confident is going to come in, and we feel really confident it's going to come in, and this person would have to sit idle for like 30 days, and we're like willing to accept that because it's worth it for that project, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. I'm going to jump ahead a little. And, whenever you're considering laying staff off, whenever you're considering terminating an employee, there's always legal implications. And, there's a whole bunch sort of that happens behind the scenes. Kevin, when business owners, business leaders have to start having these conversations, what are some of the big things that they need to consider? What are some of the big legal implications that they need to start thinking about from day one? As they start talking about, who do we keep on the team? Who, do we need to lay off? And obviously those should never be taken lightly, but from the legal side of things, compliance side of things, what are some of the questions that leaders, teams should be asking there?
Yeah, it's impossible to separate the legal from the human side. And the reason is that when I'm looking at a case or advising someone, part of the calculus is, all right, what can you do? And then what's the level of emotional reaction on the side of the employee, whoever you're parting ways with. And it's when you have the intersection of highly charged and potential legal exposure that somebody files a lawsuit. And so when this is coming down the pike, what I really thought about is there are essentially three components of it. Business side, the numbers just aren't working. We cannot make the numbers work. That's sort of outside of my scope a little bit, but I have the benefit of also like managing service providers and running a business. So I kind of am what Stacy's talking about. I go through that analysis too. Like, what does the pipeline look like? How is everybody's utilization? So you got the business side. What do the numbers look like? You've got the legal side. What can we do? What do we have to do? What do we require to do? It's a little bit like Doug's discussion of the left and right limits. Like from a legal perspective, there are certain, you have to provide notice if you have a certain number of employees and you have to, whatever. And then there is the piece that is the human side, which is if we're doing it right. And I think that I love the way you characterize this discussion. If we're doing our jobs right, there's more to this than just 2 + 2 = 4, and therefore, Jimmy's going to get downsized. It's just a lot more to it, from team harmony and cohesiveness to, if you're forced to make a difficult decision, do it in a way that is respectful and, and appreciative of the efforts that people have gone through. And I'm telling you, you can't separate that from legal exposure. They go hand in hand. It's the right thing to do, and you're a lot less likely to get sued. But so back to your more precise question, legal considerations. I pulled a quote from an article on downsizing, layoffs. There are a lot of articles on it these days. The losses incurred in discrimination litigation following a badly executed layoff can easily exceed the amount that was sought to be saved by implementing the layoff.
Yeah.
If you do it wrong, if you are not thoughtful in how you're doing it, if you do not have criteria that you're using that are neutral, that are defensible, you set yourself up for exposure that is more trouble and more expense than retaining folks. So
Yeah.
discrimination lawsuit, you got to provide notice under the WARN Act if you have certain size employer.
And is that, am I remembering that's over 100?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
You got that right. But some states are going to have different. They're going to have different rules that are different thresholds. So California, for example, beware. I don't know what the number is. It's probably 5. But yeah, you just have to look into that. And it goes back to Doug's statement of time. We don't want to be executing something on Monday turnaround. We need time to analyze and think through.
And I'll say from my experience, it feels like most of the time this is a fire drill, and it is, we've got to do something on Friday, and you're like, how long have you been looking at these numbers? Oh, for 3 months now. And now it's a fire drill. And I'm sure from your perspective, Kevin, there's a million things that could go wrong here. And now we have this shortened window really to check everything and make sure that we're doing this right. And I would say, if you're going to do this in a compassionate way, giving yourself some time to think through how to have these conversations. And certainly, and I want to dig into this from a discriminatory perspective, I think a lot can go wrong there if we don't have the right experts in the room, if we are not asking the right questions, if we're not considering the right things. So what's sort of, you said there's some neutral criteria to look at. What's the neutral criteria that you should look at to make sure, for example, that you're not, discriminating, especially when you're having to make this really difficult choice of who to lay off, who not to lay off?
Whenever you can have objective criteria that feeds into the decision, that's the best case scenario. Objective criteria like somebody had sales targets that were met, or sales targets were not met, or I sometimes see performance evaluations that haven't been challenged feed into, like, if you got below satisfactory, you're going to be one of those who is potentially let go if you're on a performance improvement plan. Now, there can be an element of how do you disaggregate that from any discriminatory animus of the person who's did the evaluation, but it's one step removed. It's not supervisor X saying, I want to have 1, 2, and 3 go. It is something that exists is being used to feed into the equation, and that removes an element of subjectivity.
Sure. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. How much of that do you tell the staff? Like, how much of that criteria do you use in those challenging, difficult conversations with the person? How much do you tell the staff who is still there when you have to announce what decisions you've had to make when it comes to layoff?
Stacy, what do you think?
We're going to see if you're going to get sued right now, Stacy.
This is very nerve-wracking. So my experience, because we were in the United States and in Canada, and Canada has a lot more labor law specifics, it was basically like very limited in what we could share. And some of that was out of certain kindnesses for the folks that were exited, and others was because it just wasn't an appropriate or necessary communication to have. What was more important was how we communicated what severance style packages may have looked like, or how they were being treated upon exit. And there were some techniques there that we may go into, I guess, later if you have that in your arsenal, Zach. But it was less about the specifics on how the folks were selected and more about how we were caring for them upon their exit that we communicated.
Sure. One of a question that came in is sort of on this topic, so I'll just put this out there. having to lay off some staff members recently, the team that was remaining was sort of upset with, not getting a chance to say goodbye. How do you balance that with the, like, this is your last day? What have you seen? And I'll just put this out there for anyone who wants to answer. How do you kind of handle that?
Well, oh my gosh. My computer keeps deciding that I'm not going to talk anymore, and then it goes black. So apologies if I black out for a second. There were times where when people were exited, we were very sort of like streamlined in that communication. And as we grew, I think, and matured, it became more like encouraging this team that remained to reach out if they felt like they wanted to connect with those folks on LinkedIn if they weren't already. And we would encourage folks to help them find a new place. That was also something that we took on, was helping folks find new opportunities and connecting them within our network however possible, and encouraging the remaining staff to do that as well. We found that to be a really like a cultural, I don't want to say a win, because anytime you do something like this, you are not having a cultural win, but that was like a way that we could show compassion for the person leaving, and also to the team for how they wanted to support that person in their next steps. So those were things that we did communicate what we were doing, and also encouraging them to connect and support them however they might be able to.
Yeah, that's great. I would say the most challenging day of leading for me in the 20 years that I've had the privilege of being able to be in a leadership position was having to lay off almost 24 staff members in one, was it like day and a half? And I mean, it was awful, because it really wasn't anything that these people had done. It really was misprojection of revenue. I mean, the list, went on and on. And for us, we made the decision, like, we are going to give team members the opportunity to say goodbye. We are going to give our staff a chance to say goodbye. And this is going to be awkward, and it's going to be weird. And there's really just no getting around it, mainly because of the human component, right? To say like, hey, your job's ending today. You didn't do anything to deserve this. We're sorry, and you need to pack up your stuff and leave today. Really felt shitty to us.
Yeah.
So whenever I can, in advising clients, to say, whatever you can do to let them say goodbye, let the team say goodbye, give them, till the end of the day or end of the week, give them access to stuff. And if they break that privilege, obviously there has to be an ending at that point. But I think even talking about what the leaving well, what that could and should look like, I think is an important part of that conversation. But I think, I heard, I think it was Brene Brown say, give as much dignity as you can to people, especially when you're laying them off. So Kevin, tell me, is that wrong? What do you need to look out for in that scenario? Because I know, like, you're kind of opening yourself up to some legal risk there by doing that.
I think that this is a different analysis than you have somebody who got caught embezzling, right? And you're like, okay, you're fired, get your stuff, let's go. This is a different analysis. And I think that it's a balance of you want people to be able to say goodbye. You want people to not feel like they are being escorted out with the security officer, because they're not. It's a different thing. So I don't have any qualms with that. And I think that it's this calculus of we're trying to give as much dignity as we can. That doesn't mean that, hey, in 60 days, we're going to let you go, and sometime over the next 60 days, but take the afternoon, take it's a Thursday, take tomorrow. You don't have to come in if you don't want to, but you can if you do.
Yeah.
And say goodbye.
I like that too. That's a great point. Giving them agency in that decision, I think, is so important. Like, if you want to come to this, you can. If you don't want to, you want us to communicate, like, we're going to give you some choice here, because there's a lot that you don't have choice over right now.
Yeah. My understanding as well is that like a Friday is an unkind day to do this because people go off into the weekend and they might be alone, and there's some hardship that comes with being alone after news like this. So choosing the day of the week strategically in the morning so that you've got your team's capacity to go through this motion and to process their own. Oh, I got an echo. Hello. I don't want to feedback everybody.
It's just barely. I mean, we could just barely hear it, so don't.
Okay, great. It's just for me then. Great. But strategically choosing a day of the week that allows them to have some space, but also to come back in if that's what you're going to provide them agency to do. Asking them if they have anyone at home and whether they are going to be alone, because that can be really hard, especially in virtual. If you work remote and then all you do is get off your computer and you're by yourself, that can be really challenging. So there's some strategic elements as well to provide some kindness.
Yeah, I definitely want to dig into that, sort of the care for people at and post. And I think just kind of going off of what you're saying, oftentimes employers do that, last thing on Friday because it's about their own uncomfortability. And they're just kind of hoping like magically by Monday, everyone has forgotten about it and is ready to like hit the ground running again, which is just a giant, I would say, lack of leadership. But I want to go back to something that we talked about earlier. And Doug, I'm going to put you on the spot here with this question. Oftentimes, I think the fire or the emergency around laying people off is because, number one, we're not looking at the right metrics. We're not looking at the right KPIs, or we're not, we're avoiding the hard conversation about them. But I think, two, oftentimes businesses have they do not have the cash on hand that they should have. They don't have the reserves that they should have. And anytime money is tight, it feels like an emergency. We've got to make the decision. We've got to, do what X, Y, Z. We don't really have a runway. We don't have, a pathway to feel like we've got some time to make this decision, which is when just things always go wrong. What is, let's say service-based businesses, what is your advice on what should we have in reserves? What should we have as far as cash on hand goes? We'll start with that KPI.
Yeah, it's a great question. I get asked that question a lot. Our team gets asked that, and you can ask probably 10 different accountants, get 10 different answers. My answer is 2 months operating expense. And here's why. That's 2 months everything. So look at everything below your revenue number, or you could take cost of goods sold out of there if your cost of goods sold are very closely tied to your revenue. But people cost, overhead cost, add that all up, multiply it by 2, keep that in cash. The reason I like that is because even if your business is running at break even, and 50% of your revenue walks out the door, you've got 2 months to figure out what to do. No, even more, you have 4 months to figure out what to do in that case. If all of your revenue leaves overnight, not going to happen. I mean, if it does, that's like, things are going to be on fire.
Consider life choices.
Things are going to be on fire. But you have the gorilla client, 50% of your revenue walks out the door overnight. You still have 4 months to figure out what you're going to do. You have 4 months worth of cash. Now, you need to, the conversation has to start immediately, but you've got that 4 month runway before it's like, we can't make payroll, and you're going to start making changes. I say every business owner is smart enough, has been through enough to start figuring things out. 4 months is too much time for most business owners to figure something like that out. So I like the 2 month number. Along with that, it almost never happens that way, which it's actually easier when it happens that way, because all of a sudden it's like, we got to focus on this. It more often happens in our revenue's down 5% this month, down 5% next month. It's down 5%. Well, we're getting close to break even. All right, we're going to dip into a loss, Stacy, 6 months from now. What are we going to do about that? Well, we got stuff. The sales team says it's coming back. And that's how it really happens. So the question I ask then of business owners, and, Zach, you talked about it, Kevin as well. And, being a business owner, the question I would ask myself is, how much am I willing to invest? Or a negative spin on that, how much am I willing to lose? How much of a loss am I willing to take? If it's service-based, it's all on the income statement. You don't even have to care about the balance sheet other than your cash on hand. How much am I willing to look at my future months of income and see that number in the red? How big am I willing to allow that to get before something has to change? And then you can start thinking through, like, okay, now I can kind of see when that's going to have to change. Now I can start thinking about, when does that sale have to come in before I have to make that decision, and almost like making the decision about when you're going to make the decision. And the other thing that I've talked to clients about, and this is probably Stacy, Zach, getting into your world, but just think through the plan. Like, what is the plan if your revenue starts to decline? Do you feel like you've thought through, hey, we're at this level, we've been growing, but what if it starts going down? When are we going to deal with that? You know, it's you lead in both directions, and how are we going to make sure that if it starts going down, that we're prepared to make that decision? It goes back to the very first thing I said, the planning and being able to see the future financially. In my world, plays a huge role in these discussions. Can you see the future well enough so that this doesn't become a fire that surprises you?
I have a follow-up question for Doug.
Go ahead.
It's like, there's also the cost of exiting certain people, right? Like, and like I mentioned, my experiences both in the US and Canada, and Canada's got different implications where you have to pay severance, especially for employees who have been there longer than like 6 months. So there's a certain cost to different people in the business. And I feel like if I could go back and do it over again, one of the things would have been to be better prepared on what those costs are, so that when we are looking at and making strategic decisions, there were going to be areas of the business that was like, frankly, that person is going to be too expensive to exit. It's not, So do you have any advice around how you, I guess, calculate, or when you calculate the cost of an exit, so that it isn't something you're doing during the fire drill?
It's really interesting. I don't think I've ever done a calculation like that.
Okay.
But based on what you're sharing, Kevin, it sounds like it's only becoming more and more expensive. And so I don't know. I guess I'd open that up to the whole panel to say, how do you build cost of exit into your projections? That doesn't sound like something that's going to be much fun to do at all.
No, but I think you're right that's what you have to do, and you have to allow yourself time to do that. Is, hey, we're going to get rid of people on Friday, and we'll just have an automatic, we don't owe anybody anything, and we save all this money. But what if they have contract? What if a handful of these people have contracts? What if you're in Canada where there's some severance provision? What if, oh gosh, it's a mass layoff, and so we have to do this calculation, and we got to pay the lawyers to do this calculation of whether there's a disparate impact. So it's having that foresight of what's coming down the pike, so you ask the right questions to come up with these, to think about them, think about the fact that, it's not as straightforward.
Yeah, because there's also, if you don't do that, then when you start to make those decisions and calculate those things, you go, oh my gosh, it's going to cost us more to exit all these people than it would be to just go dip into our credit line for 6 months or whatever it is. Yeah. Or we're not going to see the savings of this salary for however long based on when payroll is and those sorts of things, right? So there's timing considerations that I think as an operator, you have to play worst case scenario a bit earlier than you want to, so that and can advise the leadership team about, well, if we need to save, $200,000 or whatever it is, then that means we have to exit this much people and we have to save it by 60 days from now, which means we have to do the layoff on Friday.
Yeah.
Or 30, right? Like there's all of these levers that if you're not thinking about it ahead, those decisions are clouding your judgment when you're down to the wire, and making it harder for you to be compassionate and do all of the things that we're talking about.
Sure. And I think a big question, unfortunately, that I always see wait until the end is like, do we need to do severance agreements?
Yeah. Is that something that's in our values and that we can afford to do? Is it like,
Right.
what are we doing? Because now we're in a cash crunch, but we also don't want to leave people in a lurch.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
so deciding that ahead of time feels like it would be a really smart move.
Which
And
would
related-
definitely be in the cost of laying people off. And sorry to interrupt you, Kevin. Go ahead.
Yeah, oh, well, I was just going to say, relatedly, just exploring other avenues. Maybe there's some of these aren't available to all businesses, but maybe there's a segment that would like to retire early. Maybe
Right.
we could do 20, everybody's going to tighten their belt. We're doing 20% across the board, salary reduction. Maybe we're going to have sabbaticals that roll. Maybe we're going to do these different options that save money and have a different impact, but it's hard to do that if it's okay, we got to do it by Friday.
Yeah.
Right. Kevin, from a legal perspective, if you're doing severance agreements, what shouldn't be in a severance agreement?
Severance agreement, full releases. This releases everything. We're paying you X, and that results in you discharging any claims. You can't later come back and sue the company for anything. You also have to navigate the Older Workers Benefit Protection Act, which is the one that a lot of us have heard of, where you have to provide additional notice and period for consideration for workers over 40. So I would be entitled to that. So those are two things you want to consider, and don't just make up your own. I mean, most law firms are going to have a template that has been vetted, and it's worth the money to get it done right. So this is two principal things. You may incorporate some element of non-compete, non-solicit, particularly if you're going to have an extended separation pay period. You can have those run co-extensively.
Yeah. What, from a financial perspective, I'll just open this up. What are some best practices from how many weeks of severance do you give per year worked, or how do you sort of formula that out? In Stacey, Doug, maybe you have some advice to give there.
I feel like I've said it several times, so I'm sorry that I keep saying my experience is in Canada, but it's like in the Canada regulation is 1 week of severance, 1 month of severance for every year worked for the business, I think. So the longer tenured employees could get up to like 2 years or more of full-time salary, right? So that's considerable. In the US, we did more, tried to be gracious, but also more American about things. And we would do, a pay period or two, depending on how tenure and those kinds of things and how long we felt like was gracious for that employee in the context of their employment tenure and level within leadership and those sorts of things.
Yeah. Doug, any advice you have on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Stacey, what you said as far as in the U.S., it's like facts and circumstances. It's one of those where it's like we're going to not decide until we have to decide, because we know that every situation is going to be so unique. And I get that probably in the Fortune 500 they might have this scripted out and have a world where it's like, yeah, we're going to do layoffs at some point, and you hear about them in the news. But the clients we work with, small business world, there's no point in my mind, in kind of like deciding on that before you have to decide on that, because
Mhm.
there's always going to be that like, well, what does care really mean in this circumstance? And if it's scripted, it kind of starts to get away from that, in my opinion. So as much as we want a process and a procedure and a standard, and that's not something you're going to share with somebody on their first day anyway. Like, hey, let me show you our severance package policy for someday when we lay you off. I don't. Yeah, it just it stinks. But it's from my experience, it's been, we're going to decide based on the position, the role, and even what we know about this person individually, and what we really feel like has to be in place so that we can truly look them in the eye and say, we're so sorry, we care. Here's like some, we want to help as much as we can. Here's what we're doing to help you out. And Stacey, I love what you said about not just money, because money's great. It's like, good, well, at least I can put groceries, in the house for the next month or 2 weeks or whatever it is. But oh my goodness, you're going to help me get a new job. Like that's what really, that's what really solves the problem. The money is just feels like to me, just a Band-Aid.
The money is intended to be like a bridge, right? But it doesn't help longer than that bridge. So you have to get them to the other side of the bridge as fast as possible.
I think that the thing that you just have to remember whenever you're doing a severance agreement, and I would just say, like, you just have to make sure that it's uniform. So if you're laying 5 people off and you're like, you get 7 weeks and you get, okay, if we're going to do like a week or 3 weeks for every year that you've been there, that doesn't come, that's not discriminatory, right? Like, oh, I like Stacey better, so I'm going to give Stacey, 15 weeks of severance. I'm going to give Kevin 1 week of severance, even though they've worked here the same amount of time.
Kevin, does that set precedent if you do a layoff and say, hey, we're going to do a month or we're going to do a week for every year you've been here? You do it one way, and then 3 years later you have to do it again. Does it matter or no?
I don't think it. I think that the circumstances would allow you to say this is a different animal. I'm not forever setting a floor that I always have to now go forward and provide at least that. I would be more concerned if it's in the same transaction and I'm giving Doug X and Stacey 3X.
Yeah. There's also like those alternative. I hesitate to use the word benefit, but like that's not just salary. Like there have been. Not necessarily specific to a layoff, but like there has been a time where I had to exit an employee who just wasn't working out. We wanted her to succeed, and we knew that she just needed some extra help to do that. So we as part of her severance, we included like 3 connections with like a career coach or something to like help her kind of move on. Or like when we did have a more of a group layoff situation, we extended their, employee EAP, whatever that is. I can't remember that acronym, but for their like mental health care, their counselor, we extended that for like 6 months or whatever. So it wasn't like a huge financial, perk necessarily for them, but it was something that spoke to our values and wanting to care about them as people after this sort of circumstance, so that they could have counseling or whatever the case may be, career help, etc.
One of the big questions I hear often in, when you've had to make this decision is sort of the pre-announcement, right? Like, do we like tell people that layoffs might be coming?
Oh my gosh.
Do we, how do we, navigate that? Because everyone's going to be surprised. Which I would say you should be talking about your finances on a regular basis with your team. So, I mean, yes, there will be a surprise element, but it shouldn't be coming out of the blue. But what does that look like? Do you do like a pre-announcement, like, okay, next Friday or next week we might be doing layoffs? What's advice that you all have with that question that tends to be asked quite frequently?
I think in the spirit of like clear is kind, pre-announcing with no actual information, just that an announcement will be coming, is an unkind way to move forward. And that as a leader, you have to sort of bear the brunt of knowing that news until it's the right time to share that news. And that the people being exited have a right to know first before the rest of the greater team knows that it's, because you don't want anyone living in fear and like constant paranoia for whatever the period of time is. So I think moving as swiftly as you can from having the exit conversations to meeting with the team and sharing that news is like as fast as you can possibly do that is the best course of action. The longer it takes, the more people will know without you telling them directly. And that leads to some really big cultural challenges. But you just have to move forward with grace to the people that are being exited first, because they're the ones you owe any point.
Right.
This is less a legal perspective and more, I think, just a leadership perspective. But this is, I guess, back to something you were talking about, Zach, which is there shouldn't be a real surprise about the numbers aren't adding up. We need to perform better. We're for whatever reason, we can diagnose it, but it is, I think as a leader, that's sort of part of your job. And I have heard at various points that this is a little different animal, but if you are calling somebody in to let them go and they don't know why they're there, you've done it wrong. And so similarly, if you are heading into layoffs and nobody knows that that we're not making the numbers, you've done it wrong.
So Doug, what numbers should you be sharing as a business owner, as a leadership team with your team on a regular basis?
Yeah, I like sharing the utilization in some of those goals and percentages. I mean, a lot of owners aren't comfortable sharing real numbers, so then share percentages. I mean, utilization, that's just talking about are you spending your time the way that you need to spend your time to make this business work? Fair enough. How am I supposed to be spending my time? Hopefully every team member is asking that question and is getting a clear answer on what that is. And then if it's the higher level stuff, like our people cost is too high as a percentage of our top line. But what should that percentage be, and where is it, and where has it been, and where are we trending, and what does it look like in the future? And those two things go a long way in my mind. I mean, some companies have full open book management, and we get a fair amount of questions about that, and that's about all that we get is a lot of questions. And then it's like, yeah, I'm not sure that I actually want to go to the whole team. It sounds really cool, and there's some companies that have like created that culture from the very start, but I think to switch to that is really tough. So then it's figuring out what are the things that can be shared that's not going to have the team overly worried, but gives them a clear roadmap for what doing their job well looks like. So that even if they do hit that point where there's a layoff, if I try and put myself in that shoes, if I'm getting laid off, but I feel like I did my job to the best of my ability and I was doing what I was supposed to do, that's a lot easier to stomach than the like, hey, we laid you off. Why? Then you were fired in your mind. And I think that's a big piece of this is, hey, you were truly laid off. The numbers are not where they wanted. We've tried everything we can to try and get them there versus, yeah, the numbers weren't great. And we just kind of were trying to like use a layoff as an exit ramp for some people.
Right. Yeah. And I think like it just kind of goes back to clear is kind, unclear is unkind. What can we, with this idea of transparency, and usually this always does go back to your values, right? Like, what should we be sharing on a regular basis, both to help people understand, like, things are safe. We, as human beings, we do not function at our highest and best when we don't feel safe. So if I constantly feel like things are uncertain, I don't know how much this guy has in the bank or how much this lady has in the bank, like to operate the business. There's no way people are going to be bringing their whole selves to work every day, because basic human need is at the bottom of our, hierarchy of needs. So I think as leaders, we have to challenge ourselves with what do we need to be communicating? Because if, transparency looks different, I get that in every organization, but communicating something it has to be part of what we're doing, or people just aren't going to feel like they have a safe job. They're going to walk into an environment, especially if there's, been layoffs. The question that's looming in everyone's head then is like, okay, when's this going to happen again? Is this going to happen again? So it's definitely, I think, it has to be a big part of the consideration. One thing that I've been seeing lately is a lot of companies, especially in this sort of time of, I think collectively, it just feels like a lot of business owners are sort of like, what's going to happen? I don't know what's going to happen. And so, that with the gig economy, we see a lot of freelance work happening right now. We see a ton of companies hiring, okay, we've got this project, we're going to hire some freelancers, some contractors to come in and do this. What are the implications business-wise, legally? What do we need to be watching out for? I know that there's a lot of positives to that. There can also be some downsides to that. So from experience, what are you seeing? What are some considerations leadership teams need to be making when thinking about pivoting from just using employees to using contractors? Or maybe this is the supplement or answer to how do we fill utilization in the meantime?
Well, I'll right. That's
Kevin,
everybody's jumping at the opportunity to answer that one. It seems to be a different workforce, how people expect to earn a living, and law firms. Just using my own profession as an example, law firms traditionally have not been very good about thinking outside the box for how do we provide top flight service, right? It was just you have to be the person who's going to work from 8 to 7 and that's how it is. But I think that the legal profession is doing a lot better job of recognizing opportunities for alternative. Well, maybe it doesn't have to be like that. And so that can be part of the, I think, discussion of how do we make the numbers work? Well, maybe somebody only wants to be at 60%. And if they're performing at a high level, then great. Then everybody wins. So in terms of, legal implications, I don't know, but I know that in my profession, I've seen people handling it differently and been less rigid in their concept of how do we provide the services that we are promising to provide.
I think freelancers are a great opportunity to augment a team, especially if you have sort of like fits and starts of work, depending on what, industry the business is in. But especially in sort of like the digital space, being able to bring in some intermediate level, whatever it might be, development or design or those sorts of things to augment your senior team that's in-house is a really great way to amplify the team you have, assuming that you can give the team you have some space to lead and get the best out of the freelancers or the contractors. You also just have a smaller time commitment to them, right? And you can usually negotiate on price, maybe do fixed price or at a lower hourly rate. So the things to like keep an eye on are making sure that you're not eating into your margin too much, because they will tend to be more expensive on the hour than your in-house person, but it helps you deliver more work without having to maintain work for a longer period of time. Similarly, or I guess alternatively, in-house, you have to make sure that you've got the people in process to support them, because they need to have a positive experience Otherwise, they're not going to want to work with you again. So making sure that you've got team members to support. So if you get too thin internally, you're not going to be able to support a team of contractors outside. And then the last thing I would say is that there are agencies that have contractors, so you can get a team of people for a project. And then there's also like the individual contractor. So you have to balance what you need and the time frame you need it in with whether you need like a company that has a team or, you know, an individual. But you have the opportunity to outsource to places that have a you know, different cost of living. And so you can pay them a fair wage where they are, but it's less than you have to pay in the States. And there's definitely some pros and cons to all of that.
But you need to look out for that you're not treating an employee like, or a freelancer like an employee. So what are the guardrails there, Doug? What are the guardrails there, Kevin?
Oh yeah, okay. Independent contractor employee is a big legal hot button, and the Department of Labor has a 20-factor test, and that you got to go through. If you are dictating how somebody does the job and you have control over their hours, that person, you can't just say, oh, you're going to be an independent contractor. Oh, you're a freelancer, notwithstanding the fact that their office is right there and they're doing everything. If you need to be careful about trying to treat an employee like an independent contractor, and that's a multi-layered thing.
Yeah, that, and it's something to watch out for, because just because you say it's an independent contractor does not make them pass the 20-point test. Right. And I mean, Doug, you may have experience about this. Like the IRS is going to come a knocking for those taxes that you owe on that person who you said was an independent contractor and in reality was actually an employee. So definitely something that you have to be careful of. Well, we're at about an hour. So if you are watching this and need help from a financial perspective or legal perspective or from a planning perspective, we'd love for you to come visit us, talk to one of us. So Doug, where can folks find you if they're in need of fractional CFO services, accounting services?
Yeah, we're just kaufmancpa.com. There's a button on the webpage there to set up a call that comes directly to me, and yeah, happy to talk with anybody who's in this world and has, you know, financial questions. The first question is always, what's your financial clarity scale of 1 to 5? If that's on the lower end, then we're happy to talk either way. But if it's on the lower end, usually that's when it's valuable to talk to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Kevin, where can folks find you if they've got legal questions?
Klein, KLEIN, PLLC.com is our website. Shoot me an email. Happy to talk. Two-parter, though. I also want to say that we are using the Intention Collective, Zach's company, for leadership coaching, executive coaching. So I encourage people to call you also.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate that. Stacy, where can people find you?
At intentioncollective.co, I think, right?
That's right. Yeah, it was a test to see if you got our website right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Seriously, if we can be of any help, I know all of us would be happy to help you, especially in a challenge like this. So thanks for joining us. Reach out if you need any help or guidance or need someone to chat with. Have a good rest of the day, everyone.
Thanks for having me, Zach. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.